The grass had long since lost its green. By late summer, the fields around Jacob Miller's ranch were the color of old bone, dry, brittle, whispering under the steady push of hot wind. Dust rolled low across the ground, clinging to boots and fence posts alike. The wooden barns leaned slightly, darkened by decades of sun and weather, their boards warped but stubbornly standing. Nothing here was pretty. Everything here had been earned. Jacob stood alone at the far edge of the pasture, hammer in hand, resetting a fence post that had given way. The sun hung low behind him, spilling a dull orange glow across the plains. Each strike of the hammer landed heavy and measured, the sound echoing briefly before being swallowed by open land. He worked without hurry. He always did. Jacob Miller was the kind of man the West produced and then forgot to talk about. Early 30s, broad-shouldered from labor, his hands rough and scarred from years of fixing what broke instead of replacing it. He didn't waste words. He didn't waste motion. When something needed doing, he did it himself. The ranch had been his since he was barely grown. His parents were gone before he learned how to shave properly, taken by sickness one winter that didn't forgive anyone. One season they were there, arguing about cattle prices and feed costs. The next, the house was too quiet, and the land was his, whether he felt ready or not. He never left. Other boys drifted toward towns and rail jobs, chasing wages and noise. Jacob stayed, learned the soil, learned the animals, learned how to survive long stretches of silence. Grief didn't make him loud. It made him steady. The land became routine. Routine became survival. As the fence post finally set firm, Jacob leaned on the hammer and looked out across the ranch. Cattle moved slowly in the distance, heads low. The wind bent the dry grass in waves that never reached the horizon. It was a view he had seen every day of his adult life, and yet lately it didn't sit right in his chest. Something was wrong. Earlier that morning, a thin envelope had waited on the kitchen table, right where the sunlight crept in through the window. Official paper? Legal words? The kind that never arrived with good news. He hadn't opened it right away. Just stared at it while his coffee went cold. He didn't need to read every line to know what it meant. The town had been circling for a while now. Distant relatives who barely remembered his name. Men in clean coats who talked about development and opportunity. They didn't look at the land the way Jacob did. They saw acreage, numbers, profit. To them, this ranch was something to be broken down and sold off piece by piece. Jacob wiped sweat from his brow and set the hammer aside. His jaw tightened as he thought of the envelope again. Still unopened, still waiting. The clock attached to it wasn't loud, but it was constant. There was a deadline, not written in bold letters, but clear enough if you knew how these things worked. Less than a year. That was all the room he had left to stand his ground. He hadn't told anyone, not the hired hands, not the few neighbors who still checked in. He carried the weight the same way he carried everything else, quietly, without complaint. But at night, when the house creaked and the wind pushed against the windows, the thought returned. What happens when the land no longer answers to your name? Jacob had built his life around this place. Every fence, every trough, every scar in the barn walls had a memory tied to it. Losing the ranch wouldn't just mean losing property. It would mean losing the one thing that had kept him upright since he was a boy. He straightened, looking toward the house as the sun dipped lower. In the West, a man didn't need much, but he needed land. Without it, you didn't just lose your work. You lost your footing. Jacob picked up his tools and started the long walk back, the wind at his back and the shadows stretching ahead of him. Jacob learned early that the West didn't bend for anyone. It had been a winter that took his parents, not the kind that made headlines. No blizzard legends, no dramatic rescue stories. Just sickness that settled into their bones and refused to leave. First his mother, then his father a few weeks later. By spring, the house felt hollow, like it had exhaled and never breathed back in. Jacob was barely old enough to understand paperwork, let alone grief. Yet there he sat at the rough kitchen table, boots dangling above the floor, listening while a lawyer explained what his parents had left behind. Acres of grazing land, a weather-beaten ranch house, livestock, debt, responsibility, and a clause that changed everything. The ranch, the lawyer said, was his, but not unconditionally. His parents hadn't trusted chance. They believed land stayed alive only if it stayed in a family, passed hand to hand, generation to generation. So they'd tied the property to a requirement written cleanly and coldly into legal language. Jacob had to marry. He had to produce an heir, a legitimate child, not someday, by a fixed age. If he failed, the land would transfer to extended family listed in the will. At the time, Jacob didn't fully grasp what that meant. He nodded when told to nod, signed where he was told. The words marriage and children felt distant, like talk of another man's life. What he understood was simpler. The cattle needed feeding. The fences needed fixing. The work didn't stop just because the world had cracked open. So he stayed. Years passed the way they do on the plains. Slow, repetitive, unforgiving. Jacob grew into the ranch the same way the land grew into him. He learned weather by smell, not forecast. Learned animals better than people. Learned that silence could be easier than conversation. Women passed through town sometimes. Teachers, store clerks, widows looking to start over. Jacob never chased any of them, not because he didn't notice, but because he didn't know how to invite someone into a life built on routine and isolation. He was good with soil and steel, not with softness. He loved the land fiercely. The rest of the world felt distant and unnecessary. That distance became a problem the day his relatives began to appear. At first it was polite visits, a cousin stopping by just to check in, an aunt offering advice that sounded suspiciously like instruction. They dressed well, spoke smoothly, and smiled too often. They admired the view without touching the dirt. Their eyes never stopped moving. Jacob noticed how they asked about boundaries, about acreage, about proximity to the rail lines. They spoke of the ranch as if it were already a transaction waiting to happen. Their concern was wrapped in courtesy, but the hunger underneath it wasn't hard to spot. They didn't talk about family, they talked about value. As the years slipped by, their visits grew more frequent. Letters followed, then calls, always friendly, always measured, always circling the same unspoken truth. Time was running out. Jacob learned the exact date by accident, overhearing it mentioned during one of those visits, tossed casually into conversation like it didn't matter. Less than a year. That was all that stood between him and losing everything he'd built his life around. He read the documents again after that, slowly, carefully. There was no loophole, no appeal to fairness. The law didn't care that he'd kept the land alive. It didn't care that he'd poured every season of his adult life into it. The law only cared about compliance. Marriage, a child, proof. Jacob folded the papers and set them back where they belonged. His chest felt tight, but his face didn't change. Panic had never helped anyone survive out here. He went back to work, fixing fences, tending cattle, keeping the ranch running like it always had. But the pressure never let up. Every sunrise felt heavier than the last. Not because he was racing toward a goal, but because time itself had turned against him. He wasn't chasing the clock. The clock was squeezing him, day by day, closing in without mercy. At night he lay awake listening to the wind scrape against the house, knowing that everything he loved stood on borrowed ground. He didn't fear hard work. He didn't fear solitude. What he feared was losing the only place that had never abandoned him. Out here, land didn't reward good intentions. It obeyed laws written far away, by people who never felt dirt under their nails. And kindness, Jacob was learning, had no weight in those laws at all. The road that led to Jacob Miller's ranch wasn't meant for walking. It was a narrow strip of hard-packed dirt cut through dry grass and stone, used mostly by wagons and riders who knew where they were going. By midday, the sun baked it until heat shimmered above the ground. By evening, it swallowed footprints as if they'd never been there. That was where she appeared. Jacob noticed her from a distance while checking the water troughs near the corral. A lone figure moving slow but steady along the road, head lowered against the wind. No horse, no wagon, just a woman on foot, dust clinging to the hem of her clothes. She wore a faded jacket too thin for the season, worn jeans patched at the knees, and boots that had seen better years. Her hair was dark, pulled back without care, strands loose around a face marked by exhaustion. She looked tired, bone-tired, but not broken. When she reached the gate, she didn't knock or call out. She waited. One of the hired hands spotted her first and walked over, already shaking his head. Jacob watched from where he stood, wiping his hands on a rag, not moving closer yet. He'd learned to measure people before stepping in. "I'm looking for work," the girl said. Her voice was calm, not soft, not demanding. The hired hand barely glanced at her. "We ain't hiring," he replied. "Best head back the way you came." She didn't argue, didn't plead. She simply adjusted the strap of the worn bag at her side and said, "I can clean, take care of horses, mend fences. I'll do whatever needs doing." There was no desperation in her tone, just fact. The man scoffed and turned away, muttering something about trouble and strangers. The conversation would have ended there. Most did, if the sound of a sudden cry hadn't cut through the afternoon heat. Across the road, an older man riding past had lost his balance. His horse reared slightly, startled by a rut in the ground, and the man went down hard. Dust exploded around him as he hit the earth. Before Jacob or anyone else could move, the girl was already running. She crossed the road without hesitation, dropped to her knees beside the fallen rider, and steadied him with firm hands. She spoke to him quietly, checking his arms, his legs, easing him upright inch by inch. Her movements were careful, practiced, as if she'd done this before, or had learned early that waiting for help could cost you. The old man groaned but nodded when she asked if he could stand. She helped him back onto his horse, holding the reins steady until he found his balance again. Only then did she step back. Jacob had stopped what he was doing. Everyone had. He watched her brush the dust from her hands, then from the old man's sleeve, as if it mattered. The rider tipped his hat to her, clearly shaken but grateful, and continued down the road. The girl turned back toward the gate. For a moment, her eyes met Jacob's. There was no embarrassment there. No hope either, just awareness. She knew she'd been seen. Jacob didn't feel anything close to romance. What he felt was recognition. Out here, people talked plenty about who they were, but actions told the truth faster than words ever could. He just watched someone with nothing to gain give effort anyway. "That's enough," Jacob said, stepping forward before the hired hand could speak again. The man looked surprised but said nothing as Jacob opened the gate himself. "You can come inside," Jacob told her. "You look like you could use water." She hesitated only a second, glancing once more down the road, then nodded. "Thank you." They sat on the shaded porch a few minutes later. Jacob handed her a tin cup filled from the pump. She drank slowly, like someone used to rationing. "What's your name?" he asked. "Rose," she said. "Why here?" She didn't spin a story. "My mother's sick. I lost my last job taking care of her. I walked most of the way to find work." Jacob nodded. He didn't ask about tribes or backgrounds or things people like to label. None of that mattered. "What can you do?" he asked instead. She met his gaze. "Work." That was answer enough. He offered her a trial, room, meals, fair pay. No promises beyond that. Rose accepted without hesitation, as if she'd already decided she would survive whatever came next. As she followed him into the ranch, Jacob felt something shift. Not hope, not relief, but a subtle adjustment, like a door opening that he hadn't realized was closed. Rose stayed on the ranch under no illusions. Jacob made that clear the first morning. There were no promises, no guarantees, no talk of how long she could remain. Just a simple arrangement. Work for pay, meals included, a cot in the spare room of the bunkhouse. If it didn't work out, she would move on. That was how things were done in the West. Fair, clean, and final. Rose accepted it without a word. She was up before sunrise the next day, already outside when the hired hands began to stir. Jacob noticed her moving between the barn and the pump, sleeves rolled, hair tied back, working like someone who didn't need instruction. She didn't ask where to start. She looked around and chose what needed doing most. The horses were first. She brushed them carefully, checked their hooves, spoke to them low and steady. The animals responded to her in a way Jacob didn't miss. Calmer, less skittish. After that came the stalls, then the tack room, then the kitchen floor, scrubbed clean without complaint. She worked fast but not careless. Every movement had purpose. No wasted effort, no shortcuts that would cost more later. At midday, Jacob handed her a plate and told her to sit. She ate quietly, eyes lowered, like someone used to keeping track of time even while resting. It was that evening, while mending a torn feed sack, that Rose spoke of her mother. Not as a plea, not as a story meant to soften him. "My mother's sick," she said, stitching steady. "Has been for a while." Jacob nodded, waiting. "She can't work anymore. We move when we have to, wherever there's room." That was all she said. No details about doctors or towns. No mention of where she slept last week or how far she'd walked. Jacob didn't press. Out here, people shared what they chose. Anything more was a boundary crossed. What struck him wasn't the hardship, it was the way she spoke of it. Plain, direct, like bad weather you learn to live under. Over the days that followed, Rose proved herself without trying to prove anything at all. She reorganized the pantry so supplies stopped disappearing. She noticed a loose hinge on the chicken coop before it became a problem. She patched a fence section one of the men had ignored for weeks. When a calf refused feed, she stayed late until it ate. She never asked for praise, never asked for extra pay. When Jacob handed her wages at the end of the week, she counted it once, nodded, and folded the bills away carefully. Every cent, Jacob later learned, went straight toward keeping her mother alive. The hired hands noticed her too. At first, they watched her with suspicion, the way men did when someone new showed up with nothing but determination. But Rose didn't compete. She didn't talk over them or correct them loudly. She worked beside them, matched their pace, earned space instead of demanding it. Respect followed. Jacob found himself watching her more than he meant to, not in the way men watched women when they were lonely, but in the way a rancher watched a good horse or a solid fence post, with attention, with appreciation for something that held under pressure. He'd mistaken her exhaustion for fragility that first day. He saw now how wrong that had been. Rose wasn't weak. She was tired because she'd been fighting longer than most people ever had to. Fighting hunger, fighting distance, fighting a world that rarely paused long enough to offer help. One evening, Jacob found her repairing a broken latch after dark, lantern light throwing sharp shadows across the barn wall. "You can finish that tomorrow," he said. She shook her head. "Won't hold through the night." So he stayed and held the lantern while she worked. Neither spoke. The quiet felt earned, not awkward. Later, as she packed away her tools, Jacob realized something unsettled him. Not fear, not attraction, but understanding. Rose wasn't waiting for rescue. She wasn't hoping for charity or kindness to change her situation. She'd learned early that mercy was unreliable. What she trusted instead was effort, her own. The ranch had given her a place to stand. That was all she'd needed. Jacob walked back to the house alone, the weight in his chest shifting slightly. For years, he'd believed strength meant enduring alone. Rose was showing him another version, one where strength meant staying upright long enough to keep going. Change came quietly to Jacob Miller's ranch, not all at once, not in ways anyone could point to on a map or write down in a ledger at first. It showed up in small things, in fewer arguments among the hired hands, in animals that stood calmer at feeding time, in mornings that felt less rushed even though the work stayed the same. Rose didn't announce herself as anything more than a worker. She simply began keeping notes. At first, it was scraps of paper folded into her pocket, numbers written in neat, compact lines. How much feed went out each morning? How much came back untouched? Which horses needed more grain? Which cattle were wasting hay? She watched, listened, adjusted. Within weeks, the waste dropped. Feed lasted longer. Animals put on weight instead of losing it. Calves stopped falling sick as often. It wasn't magic, it was attention. Rose rose before dawn and stayed late without being asked. She noticed patterns Jacob had grown used to ignoring, not because he didn't care, but because a man alone could only track so much. She didn't criticize what he'd done before. She built on it. The hired hands trusted her because she never made herself bigger than the work. When she suggested a change, she explained why. When something went wrong, she fixed it herself instead of assigning blame. That earned her something rare on a ranch: quiet authority. Jacob watched all of it from the edges. He wasn't a man who hovered. He didn't give speeches or praise easily. But he began leaving certain decisions to Rose without comment. Feeding schedules, supply orders, repairs that needed doing sooner rather than later. Trust didn't arrive with a conversation. It arrived in absence when Jacob stopped checking behind her. Some mornings they stood on the porch with tin mugs of coffee, steam rising in the cool air. They didn't talk much, didn't need to. Rose would mention the weather. Jacob would nod. That was enough. In the evenings, they worked side by side, mending fences or tightening loose boards on the barn. Their movements began to line up without effort. One held a post while the other hammered. One reached for a tool before the other asked. No romance lived in those moments. What lived there was rhythm. Jacob had spent most of his life carrying responsibility alone. He was used to making every decision, taking every risk. Without realizing it, he'd grown rigid. The ranch ran, but it didn't breathe. Rose changed that. She brought order where chaos had crept in quietly. She brought awareness where habit had dulled sharp edges. The ranch didn't just function better, it felt steadier, like a structure reinforced from within. The men noticed. They stopped coming to Jacob for every small issue. They went to Rose instead, not because she demanded it, but because she listened and responded. Jacob didn't resent it. One afternoon, he caught himself handing her the supply ledger without thinking. The realization hit him a moment later. He didn't pull it back. That night, he sat alone at the kitchen table, looking over the figures. Costs were down. Output was up. He should have felt relief. Instead, he felt something more complicated. Dependence. It unsettled him, not because he doubted Rose, but because he hadn't relied on anyone in years. The ranch had always been his burden to carry. Letting someone else shoulder part of it felt like stepping onto uncertain ground. Yet every day proved the same truth. Rose didn't overstep. She didn't take credit. She didn't slow down. She simply worked. The ranch answered her effort the way land always did, honestly. Jacob found himself adjusting his routines without thinking about it, waiting for her input, considering her observations. The shift wasn't dramatic. It was gradual, like a river changing course 1 inch at a time. Late one afternoon, as the sun dipped low and cast long shadows across the pasture, Jacob and Rose finished repairing a section of the barn roof. They stood there a moment, tools in hand, surveying the work. "It'll hold," Rose said. Jacob nodded. "Yeah, it will." Neither smiled, neither said more. But as they walked back toward the house, Jacob realized something had already changed. Not the ranch, not the workload. The weight he carried felt lighter. Out here, people didn't talk about needing each other. It sounded too close to weakness, but the land told its own story. No one said they depended on the other. The work had already said it for them. The days grew shorter, and the pressure grew heavier. Jacob felt it in the way sleep came later each night, in how often his thoughts drifted back to the calendar hanging beside the kitchen door. He didn't mark the date. He didn't have to. The deadline lived in his chest now, steady and unforgiving. Less than a year. The ranch was running better than it had in a decade. Feed costs were down. The animals were strong. The men worked without complaint. By every measure that mattered to Jacob, things were finally right. By every measure that mattered to the law, they weren't. He waited longer than he should have. Not because he hoped the problem would solve itself. Jacob wasn't that kind of man. But because saying the truth out loud would make it real. Words had weight. Once spoken, they couldn't be taken back. One evening, after the hired hands had turned in and the land settled into its nighttime quiet, Jacob found Rose in the small office off the kitchen. She was reviewing numbers by lantern light, pencil moving in calm, precise strokes. "Rose," he said. She looked up immediately. "Yeah? We need to talk." She set the pencil down and waited. No tension, no guesswork, just attention. Jacob closed the door behind him. He didn't sit. "I haven't been straight with you," he began. His voice was level but tight. "About why I let you stay. About why the ranch matters the way it does." Rose didn't interrupt. He told her everything. About his parents' will, about the clause tied to the land, about the deadline that had been moving closer with every sunrise. He didn't dress it up, didn't soften the edges. He spoke the way men did out here, plain, direct, leaving nothing for misunderstanding. "If I don't meet the terms," he said, "the ranch goes to my relatives in town. They'll sell it off, piece by piece." Rose listened, her face unreadable. Jacob took a breath. "There's more." He explained the conditions fully this time. Marriage, a legitimate child, proof enough to satisfy the courts. When he finished, the room went quiet. He expected shock, anger, maybe tears. Rose gave him none of it. She leaned back slightly in her chair, eyes steady on his face, absorbing the weight of what he'd said. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm. "You're running out of time." "Yes. And you don't have another option." "No." Silence stretched between them. Then Jacob said the words he'd been dreading. "I'm asking you to marry me, legally, and to have a child with me." There it was, ugly, bare, impossible to take back. Rose didn't flinch. She didn't laugh either. She studied him for a long moment, not as a woman being proposed to, but as someone measuring risk. Finally, she asked a single question. "Do I get a choice?" The question landed heavier than any accusation. "Yes," Jacob said immediately. "You do. I wouldn't ask otherwise." She nodded once. Then she stood and walked to the window, looking out at the dark stretch of land beyond the glass. The ranch lights flickered in the distance, small against the night. "You're asking me to tie my body to your problem," she said quietly. Jacob didn't deny it. "I am." "And in return?" she asked. "Security," he said. "For you, for your mother, no matter how this ends." Rose turned back to him. "If I do that, why," she said, "I won't be owned. I won't be hidden. I won't be used." Jacob met her gaze. "I wouldn't have it that way," she continued, voice steady. "I have a say in this ranch, in decisions, in how things are run." "You already do," he replied. "This would just make it official." "And the child," she said. "That child is not leverage, not a guarantee, not a bargaining chip." Jacob swallowed. "Agreed." They stood there, two people facing a decision neither had ever imagined making. There was no romance in it, no promise of happiness, just reality, sharp and demanding. Out here, freedom didn't mean having good choices. It meant choosing anyway. Rose returned to her chair and sat down slowly. She folded her hands on the table, thinking. Not praying, not hoping, just thinking. At last she looked up. "I'll do it," she said. "On those terms." Jacob felt something shift inside him. Not relief, not victory, but the heavy recognition of what they'd just agreed to. Two free people stepping into a future neither wanted, because walking away would cost them everything. This wasn't love. It was necessity stripped of illusion. And sometimes in the West, that was the strongest foundation a person had. They were married on a Tuesday morning. No flowers, no guests, no music drifting through open doors. Just a narrow county office that smelled of ink and dust, a bored clerk behind a desk, and two witnesses who looked more interested in the clock than the people standing in front of them. Rose wore a plain dress she already owned. Jacob wore the same shirt he worked in most days, sleeves clean but faded from years of sun. When the clerk asked if they took each other as husband and wife, they answered evenly, without hesitation and without emotion. The papers were signed, the seal was pressed. Just like that, it was done. No one clapped. No one smiled. No one said a word that mattered. They walked back outside into the dry morning air, the courthouse door closing behind them with a soft, final sound. The world went on exactly as it had before. Wagons rolled past. A dog barked somewhere down the street. Rose adjusted her jacket. Jacob nodded toward the wagon. "Ready?" he asked. Yes. That was the entirety of their wedding conversation. The ride back to the ranch was quiet. Dust kicked up behind the wheels as the land stretched open and empty around them. Neither spoke about what they had just done. There was no need. They both understood the weight of it and the limits. Back at the ranch, they established their rules without ceremony. Rose moved into a small room down the hall from Jacob's. Separate beds, separate doors. Privacy respected without being discussed. There was no pretending this was anything other than what it was. They ate together sometimes, apart at others. No explanations required. What did change was the way the ranch was run. Rose stepped fully into the role she'd already been filling in practice. She managed schedules, supplies, and labor with clear authority. When she spoke, the men listened. Not because she carried Jacob's name, but because she'd earned their trust long before that piece of paper existed. Jacob stood behind her decisions without comment. If someone questioned an order, he didn't intervene unless asked. His presence alone was enough. It told the men everything they needed to know. Rose's word carried weight because he allowed it to. They discussed everything privately. Feed contracts, repairs, long-term plans. Rose laid out options. Jacob weighed risks. Decisions were made together, without raised voices or second-guessing. They didn't touch unless necessary. When they passed in the hallway, they stepped aside for each other, careful not to crowd. Courtesy replaced affection. At night, Jacob lay awake sometimes, staring at the ceiling, aware of her presence in the house without knowing what to do with it. Rose spent evenings reading or writing letters, keeping her thoughts to herself. They weren't acting like husband and wife. They were learning how not to hurt each other. The ranch responded to the shift immediately. Operations ran smoother. Confusion faded. The men stopped whispering and started focusing on their work. There was clarity now. Two people steering instead of one man carrying everything alone. And yet there was tension too. Not conflict, but restraint. Every conversation stayed just inside a line neither wanted to cross. One evening, as the sun dropped low and painted the barn in deep gold, Jacob and Rose reviewed the day's numbers at the kitchen table. Their shoulders almost touched, separated by inches that felt deliberate. "We should rotate the grazing next week," Rose said. Jacob nodded. "I'll move the fencing." Their eyes met briefly. Then they looked back down at the page. That was how it went. No tenderness, no anger, just cooperation built on respect. Out here, marriages were often loud affairs, filled with expectations, demands, and disappointments. This one was quiet, deliberate, stripped of illusion. They hadn't married for love. They hadn't married for comfort. They had married to survive. And in doing so, they'd chosen the hardest path of all. Building something together while refusing to claim more than the other was willing to give. There was no applause for that kind of union. But there was strength. Pressure has a way of changing the shape of quiet. As autumn edged closer, letters began arriving more often. Official envelopes, legal language, requests for verification, and reminders of deadlines that needed no reminding. Jacob stacked them neatly on the corner of his desk, unopened at first, then read and reread until the words blurred together. The ranch was thriving. On paper, it looked strong enough to last another generation. But paper was exactly what threatened to take it away. Jacob didn't speak of his fears. He never had. Instead, he prepared. Late at night, after the house had gone still, he sorted through accounts and deeds. He moved money where it couldn't be touched easily. He drafted instructions no one was meant to see yet. Plans made quietly in case everything fell apart despite their efforts. He told himself it was practical. Rose noticed anyway. She noticed the way his shoulders stayed tense even during good days, the way he lingered over paperwork longer than necessary, the way he stopped leaving documents on the table where she might see them. One night she found him sitting on the porch long after dark, staring out at land he knew by heart. She didn't ask questions, she sat beside him. They didn't touch, didn't speak at first. The night carried the sound of insects and distant cattle, steady and indifferent to human worry. After a while, Jacob exhaled slowly. "I've been planning for the worst," he said. Rose nodded. "I figured." He glanced at her, surprised by how easily she'd said it. "If this doesn't hold," he continued, voice low, "I want to know you and your mother won't be left with nothing." That was the moment the boundary shifted. Rose turned toward him fully. "You don't have to do that alone," she said. "I know," he replied, and for the first time he meant it. From then on, the nights changed. They sat together more often, sometimes on the porch, sometimes at the kitchen table long after supper, mugs gone cold between them. They shared exhaustion without needing to explain it. There were no declarations, no confessions, just presence. Rose spoke once of her mother's condition worsening, of the fear she carried quietly through her days. Jacob listened without trying to fix it, learning restraint the hard way. Jacob spoke of the land, how losing it felt like losing his parents all over again. Rose didn't interrupt. She didn't offer comfort wrapped in false certainty. She stayed. Their closeness grew sideways, not forward, built on shared silence instead of intention. Jacob caught himself watching Rose when she wasn't aware, how she leaned into work when tired, how she rubbed her temples when numbers didn't line up. He didn't name what he felt. Naming it would make it dangerous. Rose noticed him too, the way his voice softened when he spoke to the animals, the way he carried responsibility like a weight he'd never learned to set down. They were still careful. They still kept doors closed at night, still respected the structure they'd built, but the spaces between them felt thinner now, more flexible. One evening, Rose fell asleep at the table, head resting on folded arms, exhaustion finally winning. Jacob hesitated only a moment before draping a blanket over her shoulders. The touch was brief, necessary. It stayed with him far longer than it should have. He stepped back, heart tight. This wasn't part of the agreement, yet neither of them pulled away when the quiet deepened. The danger wasn't the land, it wasn't the law, it wasn't even the looming deadline. The danger was care. Care changed things. It softened edges. It introduced risk where control had lived before. If they lost the ranch now, Jacob realized, the loss wouldn't stop at property lines. And Rose felt it too, the slow, unwelcome warmth growing where distance had once protected her. Out here, survival depended on keeping lines clear. But lines once crossed even slightly had a way of fading, and neither of them knew how to step back without breaking something in the process. The day came without ceremony, no storm, no warning sign written across the sky, just a clear morning and the sound of wheels on gravel as a wagon pulled into the yard. Jacob watched from the porch, his face unreadable, hands resting at his sides. They had arrived exactly as expected. His relatives stepped down first, clean coats, polished boots, expressions carefully arranged somewhere between sympathy and confidence. Behind them came a man Jacob recognized immediately, a lawyer from town, carrying a leather case and the kind of patience that came from knowing how things would end. They didn't waste time. Inside the house, papers were laid out across the table with practiced efficiency. Dates circled, clauses underlined, signatures waiting for ink. Everything neat, everything final. Jacob stood at the head of the table, listening as the lawyer spoke. The words blurred together: transfer of ownership, failure to meet conditions, lawful succession. He had heard them all before. Hearing them now felt different. He didn't argue. There was nothing left to argue with. The months of preparation, the silent hope he refused to name, the fragile balance he and Rose had built, it all pressed down on him at once. He felt older than he had that morning, tired in a way sleep never touched. His hand hovered near the pen. Across the table, his relatives watched closely, their politeness thinning at the edges. This was the moment they'd been waiting for. The land would finally change hands. The problem would resolve itself. Jacob inhaled slowly. He thought of the ranch at sunrise, of fences repaired, of quiet nights on the porch, of a woman sitting beside him without asking anything in return. He picked up the pen. The door opened. The sound cut through the room sharper than any raised voice. Rose stood in the doorway. She looked pale, too pale. One hand gripped the frame for balance, the other pressed lightly against her stomach, fingers trembling. Her breathing was shallow, controlled, like someone bracing against a sudden drop. Every head turned. Jacob froze. "Don't sign," she said. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The lawyer frowned. One of Jacob's relatives scoffed under their breath. Someone asked her what this was about. Rose took a step forward, then another. The room felt suddenly too small, the air thick with expectation. She swallowed. "I'm pregnant." The words landed hard, not dramatic, not dressed up, just truth, spoken plainly. Silence followed, heavy and complete. Jacob stared at her, the pen slipping from his fingers and clattering softly onto the table. His mind struggled to catch up, to understand what his body already felt. "You're sure?" he asked quietly. Rose nodded. Her eyes were steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I am." Voices erupted around them. Questions, accusations, disbelief. The lawyer began rifling through papers, recalculating outcomes in real time. One of Jacob's relatives laughed sharply, already preparing to challenge the claim. It didn't matter. Jacob moved to Rose's side without thinking. He took her arm gently, grounding her, shielding her from the noise. The contact felt natural, necessary. She leaned into him just enough to steady herself. In that moment, something inside Jacob broke open. This wasn't relief. It wasn't victory. It was fear and wonder and responsibility colliding all at once. The lawyer cleared his throat. "If this is verified," he said carefully, "the conditions of the will are satisfied. Ownership remains unchanged pending confirmation." Jacob's relatives protested, loudly, bitterly. But the fight had already drained out of the room. Their certainty had cracked. They gathered their things and left soon after, anger trailing behind them like dust. When the door finally closed, the house went quiet again. Rose's knees buckled. Jacob caught her before she hit the floor, lowering her carefully into a chair. He knelt in front of her, eyes searching her face. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he asked. She exhaled shakily. "I needed to be sure. And I didn't want it to become pressure." He nodded, understanding settling deep in his chest. For the first time since this all began, the paperwork didn't matter. The land didn't matter. The deadline didn't matter. What mattered was the woman sitting in front of him, and the life growing quietly inside her. There was no celebration, no sense of triumph. Just the sudden, undeniable truth that something real had taken shape in the middle of all their careful distance. A family, not planned, not romanticized, but formed anyway. The child arrived in early spring, not on a day marked by drama or celebration, but in the quiet hours before dawn, when the land was still and the air carried the promise of new growth. The winter had been long and unforgiving, yet the ground had held. The grass pushed through the soil again, pale and stubborn. So did life. Rose labored through the night with the same resolve she brought to everything else. There were moments of pain so sharp Jacob had to turn away, afraid of what he couldn't fix. He stayed close, offering water, steady hands, silence when words would have failed. When the cry finally came, thin and fierce, it cut through the room like a declaration. Their son was small, red-faced, and breathing hard, as if already arguing with the world. Jacob held him carefully, unsure at first how to place his hands. The weight was unfamiliar. So was the feeling that came with it. He wasn't alone anymore. The ranch didn't change overnight. It still demanded work. Fences still broke. Weather still ignored human plans. But something beneath the routine shifted. Jacob no longer woke to an empty house. Rose no longer carried her fears in silence. Nights were shorter, filled with quiet pacing and murmured voices instead of loneliness. Exhaustion replaced anxiety, and it was easier to bear. The land stayed in Jacob's name. The paperwork settled. The threat that once hovered over every decision faded into the background where it belonged. But ownership wasn't what saved them. What mattered was the rhythm they built together. Rose returned to work slowly, carefully, carrying the child when she could, setting him down in the shade when she couldn't. The hired hands adjusted without complaint. The ranch adapted, the way land always did when treated with patience. Jacob learned to ask for help. Not loudly, not often, but when he did, it came. They never spoke about love the way people in town did. There were no grand promises or dramatic gestures, just shared responsibility and quiet choices made every morning. Some evenings, they sat on the porch with the child sleeping between them, the land stretching out under the fading light. Jacob watched Rose then, not as someone he needed to protect or someone who owed him anything, but as his partner in the truest sense. Rose, in turn, stopped bracing for loss. She still worked hard, still planned carefully, but the fight no longer felt solitary. They didn't believe the West was kind. It wasn't. The land didn't bend. The law didn't forgive. Survival was never guaranteed. But the West offered something else, something smaller and harder earned. It allowed people who chose each other to endure. Their family wasn't built on romance or fate. It wasn't born from hope or promises. It was built the same way the ranch was, day by day, through labor, restraint, and mutual respect. Jacob stood taller now, not because he owned land, but because he shared the weight of it. Rose rested easier, not because life had softened, but because she wasn't carrying it alone. There was no fairy tale ending waiting beyond the horizon, no assurance that the future would be gentle, just a family that worked the land together. Because love didn't arrive through vows spoken once. It arrived through a choice made every day not to walk away.